Most people don't realize it, but there is a silent, almost invisible behavior shaping a large part of modern relationships. It shows up in small moments, when you soften your no, when you rush to justify how you feel, when you explain your choices as if they need approval to be valid. It looks harmless, even respectful. But look closer. It isn't really about communication. It's about permission. And the unsettling part is this: the more you explain yourself, the less you feel like you can simply be. The Stoics understood this long before our time. The moment your peace depends on being understood, it's no longer yours. Because no explanation guarantees acceptance, no clarity protects you from judgment. And yet people spend years trying, adjusting their words, reshaping their truth, hoping that if they explain it well enough, they'll finally be seen the right way. But maybe the real shift isn't being understood. Maybe it's no longer needing to be. And once that idea settles in, something begins to change, quietly. You stop negotiating your place in the world and start standing in it. Think about the last time you said no to something, not the word itself, but what came after, the explanation, the justification, that extra layer you added to make it easier for the other person to accept. It almost happens automatically, as if no is incomplete on its own. Most people don't just decline, they explain, not because they consciously want to, but because something deeper pushes them to do it, and that's where something subtle begins to reveal itself. The need to explain is rarely about clarity, it's about permission. Somewhere along the way, the simple act of choosing for yourself stopped feeling like enough. It started to feel like something that needed approval, validation, or at least understanding from someone else. And when that shift happens, it doesn't feel dramatic. It's quiet, almost invisible. But it changes everything about how you move through the world. You stop acting from certainty and you begin acting from anticipation. You start thinking ahead, trying to predict reactions before they even happen. You rehearse your words in your head, adjusting them so they sound reasonable, acceptable, safe. It's no longer just about what you want or what feels right. It becomes about how it will be received. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Not physically, but mentally. Because now every decision carries an invisible weight. Not the decision itself, but the explanation that follows it. At some point, being misunderstood stops feeling like a small inconvenience and starts to feel like something heavier. Not dangerous in a physical sense, but emotionally unsettling in a way that lingers longer than it should. And that discomfort begins to teach you something without ever saying it directly. It teaches you to avoid misunderstanding at all costs, to explain more clearly, more thoroughly, more carefully, so you don't have to feel that tension again. And without realizing it, you adapt. You become someone who translates their inner world into something more acceptable, more digestible, more agreeable. But in doing so, something important gets lost. Because every time you reshape your truth to make it easier for others to accept, you move a little further away from yourself. And if you repeat that enough times, you begin to forget what it feels like to trust your own experience without needing validation. You begin to rely on how others respond to determine whether what you feel is reasonable, whether what you chose is valid. And slowly, your internal authority weakens, not all at once, but in small, almost unnoticeable ways. And this is where the deeper tension begins. Because now, you're not just living, you're negotiating. Not with the world, but with yourself. Every thought is filtered, every emotion is edited, every decision is rehearsed before it's expressed. And it's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain, because it never fully turns off. Even in quiet moments, your mind keeps adjusting, refining, preparing. The Stoics warned about this, not in these exact words, but in principle. They understood that much of human discomfort comes from placing importance on things outside of our control, especially the opinions of others. And when you constantly feel the need to explain yourself, that's exactly what you're doing. You're placing your sense of rightness in someone else's understanding, but no matter how clearly you explain yourself, you cannot control how you are perceived. You can speak with precision, act with intention, and still be misunderstood. And if your peace depends on avoiding that, it will always feel unstable. You begin to react instead of act, adjust instead of decide. And over time, your life becomes shaped not by what you believe is right, but by what you think will be accepted. But something shifts the moment you begin to step out of that pattern. At first, it feels uncomfortable, almost wrong. You say less. You resist the urge to justify. You allow your decisions to stand on their own without explanation. And in that space, something unfamiliar appears. Silence. Not just around you, but within you. The constant noise of overthinking begins to fade, even if only slightly. And that silence can feel unsettling because for the first time, you're no longer cushioning yourself with explanations. You're standing in your choices without defense, and that requires something deeper than confidence. It requires internal authority. The Stoics believed that a person should be rooted in their own judgment, guided by reason, aligned with their values, not swayed by approval or shaped by reaction. And that kind of stability doesn't come from explaining yourself better. It comes from needing to explain yourself less, from trusting that your decisions are valid even when they are not fully understood. And as that trust begins to grow, your relationships start to shift, not because you forced anything, but because your presence is different. You're no longer trying to convince, to please, to adjust yourself to fit expectations. And that changes the dynamic. Some people will feel it immediately. They may question you more, push you, try to pull you back into old patterns where you explained everything. But others will respond differently. They will sense the clarity, the calmness, the absence of unnecessary justification. Because there is something quietly powerful about someone who does not feel the need to defend their existence. And this is where a deeper realization begins to settle in. That respect is not gained through explanation. It is felt through alignment, through the way you carry yourself when you no longer negotiate your place, when you no longer seek permission to be who you are. Eventually, you reach a point where the need to explain begins to dissolve, not because you're trying to prove something, but because there's nothing left to prove. You trust your decisions. You accept your emotions. You allow yourself to exist without constant validation. And in that state, something changes, not just in how you experience yourself, but in how the world responds to you. You're no longer asking to be understood. You're no longer adjusting your truth to fit expectations. You're simply present, grounded, certain in a quiet, steady way. And paradoxically, it's at that moment, when you stop trying to be understood, that people begin to understand you more clearly. Because your words are no longer carrying the weight of justification, they are simply an extension of who you are. If this idea is starting to settle in, don't just move past it. Let it stay with you. Because this shift, away from constant explanation and toward internal authority, is not something you learn once and move on from. It's something you return to again and again. And subscribing to this channel isn't just about watching more videos. It's a small, intentional step. A reminder to keep choosing clarity over approval, alignment over explanation, and truth over acceptance. It often starts early, in moments that don't seem significant at first. A feeling dismissed, a reaction corrected, a response that doesn't quite land the way you expected. You express something honestly, and instead of being met with understanding, you're met with confusion or disagreement or even subtle rejection. And in those moments, something begins to form. A quiet conclusion that your natural expression as it is might not be enough, that maybe it needs to be adjusted, refined, explained in a way that others can accept more easily, so you begin to adapt. Not all at once, but gradually. You learn to translate what you feel into something more acceptable, something that won't create friction. As Carl Jung observed, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And yet for many, that process is interrupted early, shaped instead by the need to be accepted before being authentic. At first, that distance doesn't feel like a problem. In fact, it might even feel helpful. It makes interactions smoother. It avoids unnecessary tension. It creates a sense of control over how you're perceived. But over time, that control comes at a cost, because the more you rely on explanation to make yourself acceptable, the less you trust your experience on its own. You start to question your initial reactions. You hesitate before expressing something honestly. You feel the need to check, to adjust, to make sure it will be understood in the right way. And without realizing it, you begin to depend on that process. This is where the deeper pattern takes hold. Because once you start relying on others to confirm your experience, it becomes harder to stand in it on your own. You look outward for cues. You pay attention to reactions, to tone, to subtle signals that tell you whether what you said was acceptable. And those signals begin to guide you more than your own sense of truth. You adjust not because you want to, but because you feel you need to, because it feels safer, more stable, less likely to create discomfort. There's a quiet insight that speaks directly to this pattern. We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. The fear of being misunderstood often feels bigger than the reality of it. It creates a sense of urgency that pushes you to explain, to fix, to prevent something that might not even happen. And in doing so, it keeps the pattern alive, because the explanation becomes a way to manage that fear, even if it doesn't truly resolve it. And as this continues, something else begins to shift. You start to forget what it feels like to trust your own experience without needing to translate it, without needing to reshape it into something more acceptable. That original sense of clarity becomes less familiar. It's replaced by a more cautious, more calculated way of expressing yourself, one that feels safer, but also more distant, more controlled, but less authentic. Eventually, this way of living becomes your default. You don't just explain yourself in certain situations. You explain yourself in almost all of them. It becomes automatic, a reflex rather than a choice. And when something becomes that automatic, it's easy to assume it's just part of who you are, that it's normal, that it's necessary. But underneath that assumption, there's a quiet question waiting to be noticed. Not a loud or urgent one, but a subtle one that changes everything once you see it clearly. What happens when the way you've learned to feel safe is also the thing that keeps you disconnected from yourself? You begin to live in a constant state of negotiation, not with the world, but with yourself. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It's quiet, controlled, almost invisible. But internally, it's constant. Every thought is filtered before it's expressed. Every emotion is adjusted before it's shown. Every decision is rehearsed in advance, shaped in a way that feels acceptable, safe, unlikely to create friction. And over time, this becomes your normal. Not because you chose it consciously, but because it feels like the most stable way to move through the world. At first, it might even feel like a strength. You become someone who thinks carefully, who communicates clearly, who avoids unnecessary conflict. You know how to read situations. You understand how people might react. You anticipate misunderstandings and try to prevent them before they happen. And in many ways, that looks like emotional intelligence, but there's a subtle shift hidden inside that process. Because what begins as awareness slowly turns into dependence. You're no longer just aware of how others might respond. You start relying on that awareness to guide your actions. And that's where the exhaustion begins. Not because thinking is tiring, but because you're no longer just thinking about what's true for you. You're thinking about how that truth will be received. You're carrying not just your own perspective, but the imagined perspectives of everyone around you. And that creates a kind of mental weight that doesn't easily go away. It follows you into conversations, into decisions, even into moments where you're alone. Because the negotiation doesn't stop when the interaction ends. It continues internally, replaying, adjusting, refining. This is the cost of managing perception. Your life stops being about living freely and becomes about presenting yourself in a way that minimizes risk. And the risk isn't always clear or defined. It's not always about something specific. It's more like a general sense of unease that arises when you imagine being misunderstood, judged, or rejected. So you try to stay ahead of it. You explain more. You clarify more. You make sure your intentions are visible. Your reasoning is clear. Your actions are justified. But in doing so, something important starts to fade. Your connection to your own internal authority. That quiet sense that your decisions are valid because they align with what you believe, not because they are understood by others. Because once your focus shifts toward managing how you're perceived, your sense of right and wrong becomes less about your own judgment and more about external response. You begin to measure your choices based on how well they are received, how easily they are accepted, how little resistance they create. The Stoics spoke directly to this, even if they framed it in a different way. They emphasized the importance of distinguishing between what is within your control and what is not. Your actions, your intentions, your values, those are yours. But how others interpret them, how they react, how they judge, that is outside your control. And yet, when you feel the need to constantly explain yourself, you blur that boundary. You start treating others' understanding as something you can and should control. And that creates a kind of internal instability, because you're investing energy into something that will always remain uncertain. There's a clarity in the idea that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. The discomfort of being misunderstood isn't just about the misunderstanding itself. It's about what you believe that misunderstanding means. It feels like rejection, like disapproval, like a threat to your sense of self. And because of that, you try to prevent it. You explain, you justify, you adjust. Not because the situation demands it, but because the feeling behind it pushes you to do so. But this creates a deeper problem, because no matter how much you explain, you can't fully control how you are perceived. Someone can still misunderstand you, someone can still judge you, someone can still disagree. And when that happens, all the effort you put into managing perception feels fragile. It feels like something that can collapse at any moment. And that fragility creates more tension, not less. Because now, you feel the need to explain even more, to clarify even further, to make sure nothing is left open to misinterpretation. This is how the cycle sustains itself. You explain to avoid discomfort, but the act of explaining reinforces the belief that discomfort must be avoided. And over time, that belief becomes stronger than your own sense of truth. You begin to trust the process of explanation more than your own judgment. You rely on it as a way to feel secure, even if that security is temporary. And somewhere along the way, a quiet question begins to surface. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. What happens when you stop negotiating with yourself? What happens when you allow a decision to exist without explanation? Not as an act of defiance, but as an act of trust. Trust in your own perspective, your own reasoning, your own sense of what is right for you. Because the truth is, the more you rely on external understanding to validate your choices, the less stable those choices will feel. And the more you learn to stand in your decisions without needing them to be accepted, the more grounded you become. Not because others suddenly agree with you, but because your sense of certainty is no longer dependent on that agreement. And that shift doesn't happen all at once. It begins in small moments, in the decision not to explain something that doesn't need explaining, in the willingness to let a misunderstanding exist without rushing to correct it, in the quiet recognition that your internal authority doesn't need to be negotiated every time you interact with the world. That's where the anxiety begins to take shape in a way that's hard to ignore. It doesn't always arrive all at once. It builds gradually, layer by layer, thought by thought. First, it's just a small moment of hesitation. Then, it turns into overthinking. Then, into a need to clarify, to adjust, to go back and explain something again, just to make sure it was understood correctly. And even when nothing has gone wrong, even when no one has said anything negative, the urge is still there. Quiet, persistent, pushing you to say a little more, to fix what might not even need fixing. And as Seneca noted, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality, yet that imagined discomfort is enough to keep the cycle of explanation going. It's not really about the situation itself anymore. It's about what might happen if you don't step in and manage it. Because once your mind becomes used to anticipating misunderstanding, it starts treating it like something that must be prevented at all costs. You begin to fill in the gaps before anyone else can. You explain your tone, your intentions, your reasoning, sometimes before anyone even questions them, and in doing so, you feel a temporary sense of control, as if you've reduced the chance of being judged or misinterpreted. But that control doesn't last. It fades quickly, replaced by the next moment, the next interaction, the next possibility of being misunderstood. This is where overthinking becomes more than just a habit. It becomes a pattern that feeds itself. The more you explain, the more you feel the need to explain again, because each explanation reinforces the idea that without it, something might go wrong, that without it, you might be seen incorrectly. And over time, this creates a constant mental loop, one that doesn't easily turn off. Even in quiet moments, your mind keeps running through possibilities, adjusting past conversations, preparing for future ones. And the truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. No matter how clearly you explain yourself, you cannot control how you are perceived. You can choose your words carefully. You can express your intentions honestly. You can make your reasoning as clear as possible. And still, someone might misunderstand you. Someone might interpret your actions in a way you didn't intend. Someone might disagree, judge, or dismiss. And if your sense of security depends on preventing that, it will always feel uncertain. There's a clarity in the idea that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The moment your focus shifts away from your own actions and toward others' interpretations, you give up that power. Not all at once, but gradually. You start reacting instead of choosing, adjusting instead of deciding. And without realizing it, your behavior becomes shaped by something external rather than something internal. This is where the shift becomes visible. You're no longer acting based on what you believe is right. You're acting based on what you think will be accepted. And those are not the same thing. One is grounded, the other is conditional. One comes from within, the other depends on what happens outside of you. And the more you rely on acceptance as a guide, the further you move away from your own sense of direction. It's subtle at first. You make small adjustments. You choose your words more carefully. You explain a little more than necessary. And none of it feels extreme. But over time, those small adjustments accumulate. They create a pattern where your actions are no longer fully your own. They are shaped by anticipation, by imagined reactions, by the desire to avoid discomfort. And eventually that pattern becomes automatic. At that point, it's no longer just something you do in certain situations. It becomes part of how you move through life. You begin to filter yourself without thinking about it. You explain things before anyone asks. You soften your boundaries before they're challenged. And because it happens so naturally, it feels normal. It feels like the way things are supposed to be. But underneath that normality, there is a quiet tension that doesn't go away. Because even though you're trying to manage perception, you can never fully succeed. There will always be uncertainty, always a chance that someone sees things differently. And that means the effort never ends. The explaining never fully stops. The adjustment never feels complete. As Marcus Aurelius reminds us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. And the more you try to control how others see you, the further you move from that power. And that's where a different kind of realization begins to emerge. Not as a sudden insight, but as a gradual recognition that maybe this isn't a game that can be won, that no matter how much effort you put into controlling how you are perceived, there will always be something outside your control. And if that's the case, then the question shifts. Not, how can you explain yourself better, but what would it look like to stop trying to control what cannot be controlled, to act according to your own judgment without needing to secure understanding first, to allow your actions to stand on their own without constantly reinforcing them with explanation. Because the moment you stop playing that game, something changes, not in how others see you, at least not immediately, but in how you experience yourself. The tension begins to loosen, the constant need to adjust starts to fade, and in its place, something more stable begins to form. Not perfect certainty, but a quieter kind of confidence, one that doesn't depend on being understood to exist. That feeling doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from repetition, from years of reinforcing the idea that your choices need context to be valid, that your feelings need justification to be accepted. So when you begin to step away from that pattern, even slightly, your mind reacts. It tells you something is missing, that you should say more, that you should clarify, just in case. Not because the situation requires it, but because you've become used to filling that space. But if you stay with that moment, if you resist the urge to explain just a little longer, something else begins to emerge. Silence. Not just the absence of words, but the absence of that internal pressure to constantly adjust and justify. And at first, that silence feels unfamiliar. It doesn't feel peaceful right away. It feels exposed. Because without explanation, there's nothing softening your position, nothing cushioning your choices. What you decide simply exists without defense. And that's where the real shift begins. Because standing in your decisions without explaining them requires something deeper than confidence. It requires internal authority, the kind that doesn't come from being understood, but from being aligned with yourself. And for most people, that kind of authority hasn't been fully developed. Not because they lack the ability, but because they've spent so much time looking outward for validation that they've lost touch with that internal foundation. The Stoics spoke about this kind of grounding in a way that feels almost direct when you experience it. They believed that a person should be rooted in their own judgment, guided by reason, aligned with their values. Not swayed by approval, not dependent on agreement, not shaped by external reactions. And when you begin to stop explaining yourself unnecessarily, you start to move in that direction. Slowly, but noticeably. There's a quiet clarity in the idea that waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. It points to something simple, but often overlooked. That your actions don't need constant explanation to be valid. That who you are is not defined by how well you justify yourself, but by how consistently you act in alignment with what you believe is right. And the more you rely on explanation to define yourself, the further you move from that simplicity. As you continue to allow your decisions to stand without explanation, something begins to settle internally. Not all at once, but gradually. The constant noise of overthinking starts to fade. The urge to replay conversations, to refine what you said, to add what you didn't say, becomes less intense. Because you're no longer trying to perfect how you're perceived. You're simply acting and letting that be enough. This doesn't mean you stop communicating. It doesn't mean you become closed off or indifferent. It means that your communication becomes more intentional. You speak when it matters, not when it feels necessary to justify your existence. You explain when clarity is needed, not when you feel the pressure to be accepted. And that distinction changes everything, because now your words come from a place of choice, not from a place of fear. And with that shift, a different kind of stability begins to form, one that isn't dependent on how others respond, one that doesn't require constant reinforcement. It's quieter but stronger, less visible but more consistent. It doesn't demand attention, but it holds its ground. And the more you rely on that internal stability, the less you feel the need to seek it externally. Of course, the discomfort doesn't disappear immediately. There will still be moments where the urge to explain comes back, moments where silence feels too exposed, where saying less feels like a risk. But those moments become opportunities, not to force yourself into silence, but to notice the impulse, to understand it, and to choose differently when it feels right. Because this isn't about becoming rigid or unresponsive. It's about developing the ability to stand in your choices without needing to constantly support them with explanation. To trust that your decisions are valid because they align with your judgment, not because they are understood by others. And that kind of trust doesn't come from saying more. It comes from needing to say less. Over time, this becomes less of a conscious effort and more of a natural way of being. You don't have to remind yourself to explain less. It simply happens, not because you're holding back, but because there's less to prove, less to justify, less to defend. And in that space, something becomes clear, that the stability you were trying to create through explanation was always available within you. It just required you to stop looking for it in places where it could never fully exist. And when you begin to reach that point, something starts to shift in a way that is hard to ignore. Not just internally, but externally. Your relationships begin to change. Not because you sat down and decided to change them. Not because you forced new rules or boundaries in a dramatic way, but because your presence itself is different. You're no longer approaching interactions with that subtle need to be understood at all costs. You're no longer shaping your words to secure approval before you speak. And that shift, even if it's quiet, is noticeable. At first, it might feel almost invisible. You say a little less. You explain a little less. You pause before adding that extra justification, and sometimes you simply don't add it at all. And in those moments, the dynamic begins to change. Because people who are used to a certain version of you, someone who explains, who softens, who adjusts, begin to feel that difference. Not always consciously, but they feel it. There's less to grab onto, less to question, less to reshape. Some people respond to that change immediately. They might push back, even if it's subtle. They might ask more questions than usual. They might try to pull you back into old patterns where you explained everything, where you made your reasoning clear, where you ensured that nothing was left open to interpretation. And when that happens, it can feel uncomfortable, not because you've done something wrong, but because the dynamic they were used to is no longer being reinforced. And as Epictetus taught, if you seek to please others, you risk losing yourself, so that discomfort is not a sign of error, but of realignment. That discomfort is not random. It comes from a shift in balance. When you were constantly explaining yourself, you were also in a way offering control. You were giving others the ability to evaluate, to interpret, to approve or disapprove with full context. And now, without that constant stream of explanation, that control is reduced. There's less material to analyze, less space to influence, and for some people, that change feels unsettling. But not everyone responds that way. There are others who notice the same shift and interpret it differently. They don't see it as distance or resistance. They see it as clarity, as calmness, as a kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. And without needing to explain anything, you begin to be perceived differently. Not because you're trying to project something new, but because you're no longer diluting your presence with unnecessary justification. There is something inherently powerful about someone who does not feel the need to defend their existence. It's not loud. It doesn't demand attention. But it creates a sense of stability that others can feel. Because when someone is not constantly adjusting themselves to fit expectations, there is a consistency in how they show up. And that consistency builds a different kind of respect. Not the kind that comes from being agreeable, but the kind that comes from being aligned. This is where a deeper realization begins to take shape. That respect is not something you earn by explaining yourself better. It's not something you secure by making your reasoning more clear or your intentions more acceptable. It comes from something more fundamental, from the way you relate to yourself, from the way you stand in your decisions without needing them to be validated externally. There's a quiet truth reflected in the idea that no man is free who is not master of himself. Because when your actions are constantly shaped by the need to be understood, you are not fully directing them. You are responding, adjusting, negotiating. But when you begin to act from your own judgment, without that constant need for approval, something changes. You're no longer moving in response to others. You're moving in alignment with yourself. At the same time, certain relationships may begin to shift in ways that feel unexpected. Some connections that once felt easy might start to feel strained, not because something is wrong, but because they were built on a dynamic that no longer exists. A dynamic where you explained, adjusted, and made yourself easier to accept. And without that pattern, the foundation of those interactions changes. This is not necessarily a loss, even if it feels like one at first. It's more of a realignment, a shift toward relationships that are based on mutual respect rather than subtle imbalance. Because when you no longer feel the need to justify yourself constantly, you also stop accepting situations where that justification is expected as a condition for acceptance. And over time, this becomes more natural. You don't have to think about it as much. You don't have to remind yourself to explain less. It simply becomes part of how you interact. Not because you're holding back, but because there is less to prove, less to manage, less to defend. In that space, something becomes clear. That the way others respond to you is often a reflection of how you relate to yourself. When you treat your own choices as something that needs constant validation, others tend to follow that pattern. But when you begin to treat your choices as valid on their own, without constant explanation, that pattern shifts. And with it, the entire dynamic of your relationships begins to change. Eventually, you reach a point where something quiet but profound settles into place. It doesn't arrive with a clear announcement. There's no dramatic moment where everything suddenly changes. It's more subtle than that. One day you notice that the urge to explain isn't as strong as it used to be. The impulse is still there, but it no longer controls you in the same way. You pause, you feel it, and then you let it pass. And in that space, something becomes clear. There's nothing left to prove. This isn't because the world has suddenly become more understanding or more accepting. People are still the same. Reactions still vary. Misunderstandings still happen. But your relationship to those things has shifted. You no longer see them as something that needs to be managed or corrected at all costs. You begin to see them as part of the natural flow of human interaction, not as a threat to your sense of self. And because of that, the need to constantly adjust, to clarify, to justify begins to dissolve on its own. You trust your decisions more, not because you're always certain, but because you no longer require certainty to act. You understand that doubt can exist without invalidating your choices. You allow yourself to feel what you feel without needing to explain it in a way that makes it acceptable to others. And that acceptance creates a kind of internal stability that doesn't depend on external confirmation. It's not loud or obvious, but it's steady. In that steadiness, something else begins to change. The way you experience yourself becomes simpler. There's less internal noise, less second-guessing, less need to replay conversations or imagine alternative explanations. You act, you speak, and then you move forward. Not because you don't care, but because you no longer feel the need to control every outcome. And that shift creates a sense of presence that wasn't there before. At the same time, the way the world responds to you begins to shift as well. Not in a dramatic or immediate way, but gradually. People start to perceive you differently. There's a clarity in how you communicate, even when you say less. There's a consistency in how you act, even when others don't fully understand your reasoning. And that consistency creates a kind of trust, not the kind that comes from explanation, but the kind that comes from alignment. You're no longer asking to be understood. That question doesn't carry the same weight anymore. You express yourself when it feels right, but you don't depend on the response to validate what you've said. You're no longer negotiating your place in conversations, in relationships, in situations. You occupy that space without needing to justify it. And that presence changes the dynamic in a way that's difficult to explain, but easy to feel. There's a quiet strength in that state, not because it makes you immune to misunderstanding, but because it removes the need to constantly correct it. You allow people to interpret you in their own way, without feeling the need to intervene every time. And in doing so, you create space for something unexpected, for others to meet you without the layers of explanation that used to surround your words. And that clarity has a quiet effect on how you are seen. Because when you are no longer trying to convince, your words carry a different weight. They are not shaped by the need to be accepted. They are shaped by the intention to be true. And that difference is felt, even if it's not always consciously recognized. People respond not just to what you say, but to how you say it. To the absence of hesitation, the absence of over-explanation, the absence of that subtle need for approval. Paradoxically, it's in this state, when you stop trying to be understood, that understanding becomes more likely. Not because you've explained yourself better, but because there's less interference, less noise, less adjustment. Your communication becomes clearer precisely because it is simpler, because it is not carrying the extra weight of justification. This doesn't mean every interaction becomes easy or every relationship becomes perfectly balanced. There will still be moments of tension, moments of disagreement, moments where you are misunderstood. But those moments no longer define your experience. They don't pull you into the same cycle of explanation and adjustment. You notice them, you acknowledge them, and you move forward. And in that movement, something important becomes clear. That your sense of self was never meant to be negotiated. That your choices were never meant to be constantly justified. That your presence does not need to be explained in order to be valid. These are not ideas that need to be proven. They are realities that become obvious once you stop trying to defend them. Over time, this way of being becomes natural. You don't think about it as a strategy or a technique. It's simply how you move through the world, grounded, present, certain in a quiet, steady way. Not because everything is always clear, but because you trust yourself enough to act without needing constant confirmation. And that trust changes everything, not just in how you see yourself, but in how you experience life as a whole. Because when you are no longer trying to explain yourself at every turn, you free up a part of your mind that was always occupied. And in that space, something else can grow. Clarity, focus, a deeper connection to your own thoughts and values. In the end, the shift is simple, but not easy. You stop explaining yourself, not because you've decided to prove something, but because there's nothing left to prove. And in that quiet realization, you begin to experience a kind of freedom that was always available, just hidden beneath the constant need to be understood. At some point, you realize it was never about explaining yourself better. It was about finally trusting yourself enough to stop. And when that happens, everything changes. Not because the world becomes clearer, but because you do. If this spoke to you, don't let the momentum fade here. There's another video on your screen that will take this even deeper. Watch it next. And thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.